I dare make a pro-Trump comment. I don't know if I'm allowed.
Will certainly be censored by the
yeah,
Ministry of Truth on the internet.
Somebody's not going to be happy about this. But in many ways, when I was rereading it, I kept thinking, man, what they needed was a Trump.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Because what was Trump, or what is Trump? He just sort of broke through all of this. If you're talking about how do you break the duopoly, how do you break the false choices, how do you break political correctness, all of these things, who has been the greatest breaker of those things? It's been Trump. So it's like, in a weird way, if the book had ended and there suddenly was this person who was just willing to do it for some very bizarre reason, and perhaps he was orange and had weird hair.
Is that true? No. 1984 did not imply that the world needed a man like Trump or strong men straight out of an Ayn Rand novel. It's a rather strange conclusion to come to when, in the novel, no strong man comes and saves the day. That wasn't the point of the story. Actually, the strong men are the ones in charge and are misleading the prose by, continuously lying, having inconsistent lies, and rewriting the past to always remain in power. Like what Trump does. What Rubin is doing is appropriating the works of the democratic socialist George Orwell to fit a right-wing narrative. But Mr. Rubin isn't the only one who engages in the appropriation of George Orwell. Conservatives, probably since his death, since the dead can't defend themselves, have used his critiques of authoritarianism, capitalism, fascism, and Stalinist movements as a way to dunk on leftists. You may have seen people use 1984, like Rubin, to say that Big Brother is what socialism leads to, and their control of the populace is what Jeremy Corbyn and Bernie Sanders wanted. Hey, apparently caring about the poor and marginalised groups is somehow totalitarianism. We're definitely not upholding the social hierarchy of white supremacy in the ruling class. Now that I think about it, I'm sure it says that in the origins of totalitarianism. There is zero difference between good and bad things, but bad things sure seem rad. So let's make life worse for everybody by voting people with obvious intention to cause harm. Seems like a fair assessment of conservatism, if you ask me. Getting back on topic, I think it's important to understand Orwell's ideas and how conservatives have hijacked them for ill intents. Let's discuss it.
To kick things off, this video won't cover Orwell's life, though some aspects will be brought up for necessary points. It is to mainly cover his ideas. So this video is not meant to glorify the man. Not like I would, since he was a homophobe. Man of his time, sure, but a dick regardless. With that out of the way, 1984 can be a good way of knowing the man's ideas even though what he wrote is fiction. When you read it, you come to the sense that Orwell isn't just talking about the villainous government Big Brother. The book wants to tell the reader how totalitarian regimes generally operate and attempt to control almost every facet of society from social and political life, which Rubin tried to frame that the control of language by Big Brother is how PC culture acts. It also includes an overview of how a surveillance state works and shows what that life would look like. Orwell got his ideas of a surveillance state due to how, during the Second World War, the government issued propaganda during his time working at the BBC. He wasn't entirely against the idea of propaganda, as the man who interviewed Orwell for his job at the BBC said, "He absolutely accepts the need for propaganda to be directed by the government and stressed his view that, in wartime, discipline in the execution of government policy was essential." But he was worried about the overreaching of government propaganda. Other influences came from the time he found it difficult to publish Animal Farm, as publishers didn't want to sell anything critical of the Soviets due to the alliances of the UK, America, and the USSR. One publisher would have gone with Animal Farm, but was consulted by the Ministry of Information and turned it down. Another instance that helped influence him was his time during the Spanish Civil War. As fascism was spreading across Europe, from Italy and Germany to Oswald Mosley promoting fascism in the United Kingdom, Spain was being enveloped by this destructive ideology. But Spanish anarchists and communists stood against Franco and his fascist army, breaking out the Civil War. In the midst of this war, places like Catalonia were taken over by the workers and they attempted to create a socialist society. Orwell went to Spain to fight against fascism and was shocked to see some semblance of socialism existed there. What further influenced his view on propaganda was how most newspapers outside of Spain did not mention a workers' revolution to overthrow capitalism was happening. Even the Communist Party of Spain betrayed the anarchists and communists who were allies with the poem, which stands for the Workers' Party of Marxist Unification, by framing them as allies of fascists. I have given reasons for thinking that the communist version of the Barcelona fighting cannot be taken seriously. In addition, I must say something about the general charge that the poem was a secret fascist organization in the pay of Franco and Hitler. This charge was repeated over and over in the communist press, especially from the beginning of 1937 onwards. It was part of the worldwide drive of the official Communist Party against Trotskyism, of which the poem was supposed to be representative in Spain. Reasons for why the party betrayed the socialists, the anarchists and communists were because the party was an ally with the USSR, and they stood by that there must be what Marx believed would happen, an international proletarian revolution to overthrow capitalism. Since there wasn't one at the time, they believed it was too early for a revolution for socialism and backstabbed the movement. In particular, the Communist Party, with Soviet Russia behind it, had thrown its whole weight against the revolution. It was the communist thesis that revolution at this stage would be fatal, and that what was to be aimed at in Spain was not workers' control, but bourgeois democracy. Conservatives took Orwell's critiques of the news press and a surveillance state and believed that his ideas described the more liberal, more progressive news press, like somehow using someone's preferred pronouns is what Orwell warned about. But the reality is that conservatives use Orwell to discredit and reject all forms of intelligentsia and scientific reality. Maybe it might be due to the case that most conservatives view themselves as very libertarian, so they think Orwell offered an insight into their notion of what a tyrannical government looks like. This misrepresentation of his beliefs likely stems from what most people believe socialism is. Socialism tends to be, in their minds, the centralization of government, dictatorial power, nationalization of every industry, labor camps, control of education and language, etc. So they think Big Brother is a socialist government. That would be odd, though, of a democratic socialist to write a dystopian world brought on by the system he advocated for. What then is socialism? It is an economic ideology that advocates for the collectivization of the means of production by the working class, meaning there is no employer, no government control, and the abolition of private property. This does not entail the government owns your house. Your home and personal property is not taken away from you. Land that is used to manufacture is abolished from the hands of private individuals and collectively owned by the people. That's basically the gist and a more simplified version of socialism, but it's the key components that make a country socialist. How could conservatives come to the conclusion that Orwell wrote against socialism then? He explicitly said once, "The Spanish War and other events in 1936 to 1937 turned the scale. Thereafter I knew where I stood. Every line of serious work that I have written since 1936 has been written directly or indirectly against totalitarianism and for democratic socialism as I understood it." He wasn't secretive about his support for socialism. Throughout all of 1984, socialism is strongly advocated for. It is so clearly written, it should be impossible to ignore it. Socialism, a theory which appeared in the early 19th century and was the last link in a chain of thought stretching back to the slave rebellions of antiquity, was deeply infected by the utopianism of past ages. But in each variant of socialism that appeared from about 1900 onwards, the aim of establishing liberty and equality was more and more openly abandoned. The new movements which appeared in the middle years of the century, Insarg in Oceania, Neo-Bolshevism in Eurasia, Death worship, as is more commonly called in East Asia, had the conscious aim of perpetuating unfreedom and inequality. These new movements, of course, grew out of the old ones and tended to keep their names and pay lip service to their ideology. In a world in which everyone worked short hours, had enough to eat, lived in a house with a bathroom and a refrigerator, possessed a motor car or even an aeroplane, the most obvious and perhaps the most important form of inequality would have already disappeared. It was possible, no doubt, to imagine a society in which wealth, in the sense of personal possessions and luxuries, should be evenly distributed, while power remained in the hands of a small privileged caste. But in practice, such a society could not long remain stable. For if leisure and security were enjoyed by all alike, the great mass of human beings who are normally stupefied by poverty would become literate and would learn to think for themselves. And when once they had done this, they would sooner or later realize that the privileged minority had no function and they would sweep it away. In the long run, a hierarchical society was only possible on a basis of poverty and ignorance. To return to the agricultural past, as some thinkers about the beginning of the 20th century dreamed of doing, was not a practical solution. It conflicted with the tendency towards mechanization which had become quasi-instinctive throughout almost the whole world, and, moreover, any country which remained industrially backward was helpless in a military sense and was bound to be dominated, directly or indirectly, by its more advanced rivals. Nor was it a satisfactory solution to keep the masses in poverty by restricting the output of goods. This happened to a great extent during the final phase of capitalism, roughly between 1920 and 1940. So how then does Orwell's support for socialism get ignored by conservatives? It's not like you can separate his critique of authoritarianism and propaganda from his support for socialism. They're both interlinked. When he criticized the news press for obscuring the truth, they did it on the behalf of the government as well as the bourgeoisie. He very much understood that democracy and capitalism cannot coexist because there is no democracy in the workplace and the capitalists have influence in social and political life through their accumulation of capital. Since he was an anti-authoritarian, it would naturally lead him to be an anti-capitalist due to his innate authoritarian nature because capitalism needs inequality, poverty, cheap labor to survive, and will thus use authoritarian measures to suppress any advocacy for economic equality by the use of the police or fascist movements. Another reason as to why Orwell's socialism is ignored is his critique of the Soviet Union and its totalitarian structure. Conservatives associate the USSR with communism as the revolution had the goal of communism in mind. Due to the atrocities the USSR committed and engaged in basically red fascism, communism got tied with the USSR as an evil, murderous ideology. But the simple truth is that the Soviet Union was as communist as the Nazis were socialist or North Korea a democratic republic. The goal of communism, the idea of a classless, stateless, moneyless society that communism strives for, was either abandoned or was never sought after in the first place by Lenin and the Bolshevik Party. Power was concentrated in the state, anarchists and actual socialists were purged and an autocratic empire was created. Karl Marx, who Orwell was an admirer of for his analysis of capitalism, believed democracy was a key component in a socialist society as democracy is the road to socialism. The very ideals of Marx were ignored and the Soviet Union, under the veneer of pursuing communism, was a totalitarian state capitalist country. If you read Animal Farm, you would know it to be a satire of the Russian Revolution and Stalin's rise to power. It was a warning not of communism, but of Stalinism and Marxist-Leninism. It is the warning of how totalitarians will hijack a movement motivated by the intentions of equality and justice. While not from Animal Farm, you might remember this from 1984, which demonstrates Orwell's understanding of this. The aim of the high is to remain where they are. The aim of the middle is to change places with the high. The aim of the low, when they have an aim, for it is an abiding characteristic of the low that they are too much crushed by drudgery to be more than intermittently conscious of anything outside their daily lives, is to abolish all distinctions and create a society in which all men shall be equal. Thus, throughout history, a struggle which is the same in its main outlines occurs over and over again. For long periods, the high seem to be securely in power, but sooner or later there always comes a moment when they lose either their belief in themselves or their capacity to govern efficiently, or both. They are overthrown by the middle, who enlist the low on their side by pretending to them that they are fighting for liberty and justice. As soon as they have reached their objective, the middle thrust the low back into their old position of servitude, and themselves become the high. Reading Homage to Catalonia, Orwell expresses the importance of his time serving with the anarchists in his fight against fascism. What he saw in Catalonia showed to him that socialism was a real possibility, that a classless society could exist, and that all people could live fairer lives. It may have been short-lived, but it was close to becoming a reality. One had been in a community where hope was more normal than apathy or cynicism, where the word comrade stood for comradeship, and not, as in most countries, for humbug. One had breathed the air of equality. I am well aware that it is now the fashion to deny that socialism has anything to do with equality. In every country in the world, a huge tribe of party hacks and sleek little professors are busy proving that socialism means no more than a planned state capitalism with the grab motive left intact. But fortunately, there also exists a version of socialism quite different from this. The thing that attracts ordinary men to socialism and makes them willing to risk their skins for it, the mystique of socialism, is the idea of equality. To the vast majority of people, socialism means a classless society, or it means nothing at all. And it was here that those few months in the militia were valuable to me. For the Spanish militias, while they lasted, were part of a microcosm of a classless society. In that community, where no one was on the make, where there was a shortage of everything but no privilege and no bootlicking, one got perhaps a crude forecast of what the opening stages of socialism might be. And, after all, instead of delusioning me, it deeply attracted me. The effect was to make my desire to see socialism established more actual than it had been before. Hopefully I've shown you the concrete stance of Orwell's leftist views. As said earlier, it should be impossible to not know he was a leftist. Especially people who claim to have read his book should know this, right? Right? Orwell saw the threat of Marxism and deftly put it into words. That is the reason it feels familiar right now with Marxists as active as they are in society. Going through these comments is kind of shocking. I think the parallels to left-wing hate mob counterculture are very clear. I don't care if George Orwell was a socialist. After World War II, communism almost took over in England along with a hangover from Nazism. This is a book about what communism actually will do because it has happened in every country that embraces it. Orwell warned us to double speak as newspeak, PC, and that 2 times 2 equals 5 and 2 plus 2 equals 5. Multiple genders. Here we are. Yes. Because Orwell warned us about transgender people. Okay. What? Was Orwell predicting, or was he announcing what was coming from the left?
I wonder if the reason Orwell was able to describe the situation so amazingly is not because he could see into the future, but because he lived in countries taken over by communism, which was built on lies.
Heading towards a twisted future version of it called 2084. Liberty is oppression, speech is violence, man is woman.
I can still vividly recall when Marxist progressive leftists started buying this book right after Trump was elected. Our sales quickly subsided when they realized that Orwell was writing about them and their political ideology.
George Orwell, supposedly intelligent, can't see the connection between democratic socialism and communism and authoritarianism, etc.
I've been saying it for 20 years now, maybe longer. Time is speeding up. The world we live in is becoming more and more an imitation of Orwell's 1984. Had I not lived through the last 20 years, this year in particular, I would not have thought it possible for an entire culture, the West, to be totally subsumed and undercut by blatant, militant, in-your-face, illiberal, regressive Marxist fascism. But the Bible... The Bible has warned us for a few millennia that the end times would be weird and horrid. That's no lie. George Orwell was a literary genius, and from what I can tell, a future predictor as well.
It is a depressing story, but a terrible look into the future from the perspective from the mid-20th century. It should be read by every child so they can see what a life under authoritarianism, tyranny, and leftist politics would be like. What? This is what will happen if JC and his cronies got voted in, God forbid. Oh my fucking god. With Orwell's status as the conservative hero and to some extent the far right using iconography of his work, it's not unusual that historical figures have had their beliefs whitewashed. One other figure that comes to mind is Martin Luther King. We know him as the man who fought for black emancipation, protested peacefully through direct action, and gave his powerful "I have a dream" speech. But he didn't just fight for racial equality. The man was a socialist. Before his assassination, he tried to start a multiracial workers' movement to fight for economic equality. He said, and I quote, "I imagine you already know that I am more socialistic in my economic theory than capitalistic, and yet I am not so opposed to capitalism that I have failed to see its relative merits. It started out with a noble and high motive to block the trade monopolies of nobles, but like most human systems, it falls victim to the very thing it was revolting against. So today, capitalism has outlived its usefulness. It has brought about a system that takes necessities from the masses to give luxuries to the classes." Conservatives have used King to denounce Black Lives Matter as a violent, somehow black supremacist movement that King would oppose. But the reality is that the vitriolic bad faith arguments against BLM were used exactly the same way about King. They called him a rioter and a communist, just like they called BLM Marxist, which means nothing considering they don't know what either of those terms mean. King may have admired Marx as Orwell did for his critique of capitalism as well. Perhaps this bearded guy has some good ideas considering so many smart people admire him. He rejected communism ultimately because he was devotedly religious and he felt communism posed a threat to Christianity. Considering the era he was in, communism was associated with the Soviet Union. I really don't blame him for that. Of course, this didn't stop conservatives literally putting up billboards that King was a communist, trying to insinuate that he's a threat to American society. Even the centrist liberal types can be as frustrating as conservatives, as they claim to care for equality, but will side with the reactionaries to maintain peace and order. To draw an example of people who do this, the current Labour leader Keir Starmer claimed he supports BLM, but then said the advocation for police defunding was nonsense, and called the movement a moment, downplaying the importance of why this movement exists. These people who do this currently are the same people King referred to back in his day as the white moderates. He felt the white moderate was a much greater hindrance than the KKK for black emancipation, as there were more white moderates than KKK members, just to clarify, as they cared more for order than to pursue justice. They agree in the goal of equality, but think direct action and the demands from these movements are going too far. His critical analysis of the white moderate he wrote in his jail cell in Birmingham doesn't get brought up that much, just like his support for socialism. Key figures in the civil rights movement, Malcolm X, Fred Hampton, and plenty of the Black Panther members were socialists, and yet many people don't know about this. For people at the bottom of the social class, black people living under white supremacy, women under patriarchy, Jews in an anti-Semitic society find the ideals of socialism appealing because socialism speaks to the language of the poor and marginalized. It offers a fair and just and equal society that capitalism fails to offer. Conservatives engage in this historical revisionism so people don't understand the extent individuals and movements fought for, almost like rewriting the history of events to serve your own agenda. Wait, didn't Orwell warn about this?
I suppose we've always been at war with the state, you know.
What I wanted to demonstrate in this video is that to learn what people like Orwell said and believed in, the process is simple. Read what he said. Read his books, because he made it explicitly clear on where he stood. Considering Dave Rubin took the opportunity to star in a video about 1984 and twisted Orwell's work to his audience that may not be familiar with the book and author so he can sell conservative propaganda. This should tell you that these people are trying to dissuade people from finding out factual information by spreading misinformation, creating confusion and distrust in more reliable sources. Kind of an Orwellian move there, Dave. You're really playing into that ignorance is strength card really well. When people say that 1984 describes a communist society instead of a fascist one, they typically do this to dissuade young people or even themselves from realizing that capitalism creates the problems of inequality and needs to be replaced. Just like Marx and Kropotkin, Orwell is an important figure in socialist thinking. His understanding of authoritarianism is insightful because not only must we be wary of right-wing authoritarianism, as it's the more dangerous version, movements that pride themselves as socialist but are authoritarian need to be countered with. Freedom is crucial to creating a better society. That's literally what Marx wrote about, and these right-wing hacks like Dave Rubin don't care about that. They're fine with the status quo as it is. They're getting paid by billionaires to disseminate conservative dogma. The ordinary conservative will eat this up thinking any government assistance is bad, and communists and leftists, and sometimes even liberals, are fascists, and that they're the ones causing the problems that most people, both economically and socially, face. Even if they're the ones having to face socioeconomic problems of poverty, alienation, depression, they're being misled and told lies. If you enjoyed this video, please like and share. Sharing does greatly help my channel grow. Thanks for sticking around to the end and hearing me ramble about stuff. If you like my channel, stick around. I'll always try and find interesting topics to talk about. Until then, I shall see you in the next video.